Okay, it's a running. We made progress last time, even though we have some pretty complicated stuff. We still have more complicated stuff to go through. So here's the words of the day. Let me see if I've got, oh, this looks darkish. This is one of those words, whenever you see, well, when you're reading your Greek and you have an accented U's, E's, and O's, it's an H sound. It's an aspirated sound, like hallelujah, for example. So U, P, E, N, A, N, T, I, O, U, S. Hoopin, hoopin, hoopin cough. Hoopin antius. Hoopin antius. Trying to pronounce that. Hoopin antius. Okay, so hoopo means under. Antios means antios. Okay, this comes from two. So antios, opposite. This is anti. And let's see, what's the other word? Anti, primary preposition, anti, and a particle opposite of. That's the opposite of plus contrary. Okay, opposite. Okay, what does it mean? Hupin antios means specifically contrary, covertly contrary, covertly contrary. The reason this is important is because the translation, okay, it is translated as adversary and against. So, okay, that's close-ish, kind of close-ish. But covertly contrary, you know, when you see these hoopy words, the hoopy words, we've had a lot of these hoopy words, they're kind of like the para words. So you get a para word and you go, wow, that has a lot of deep meaning to it. Well, these hoopo words do too. It's the same as the hoopo, I can't remember the second part of it, but you remember the one that talks about Christ is just as Christ is the head of God, and Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman, right? And that's not head of. It's not. The word is not cephalus. The word that's used is hupe, and the word meaning that Christ is hupe. In other words, under God. But how can Christ be under God? The statement is made in the New Testament that Christ is put over the creation by God, which is really different. And remember, I told you, when you read those statements, especially about the sequences, that what it's talking about is authority of, that you are granting authority. In other words, God has granted authority to Christ. Christ has granted authority to man. Therefore, man must grant authority to his wife. And if we read it, we think the way it's listed in our New Testament, we think what? Control. When it's giving the opposite, it's saying because you have this, you have a certain authority that you grant it, and especially in that culture. I mean, why would anyone in that culture with gynoecium say that, oh, man is the head of woman? You kind of look at him and go, are you an idiot? Right? So when you see things like that, especially within context, and you go, but it comes back to Rick's question. I think Rick had a great question, and I love it when people ask that question. Well, why do we find the translations to be so weird sometimes, so wrong? If you're King James, you certainly want a Bible that tells people to pay their taxes and obey the government, right? And if you're Constantine, you sure want a Latin translation that tells everybody to pay their taxes and obey the ruler, right? So guess what it says? Pay your taxes, obey the ruler. And everybody knows that Well, in the Greek, it doesn't say that. Well, Shazam. That's the interesting thing about especially translations that are developed by leaders or whatever, by leadership, especially in government. This other word is very interesting. Here's EK, EC, EK, whatever, EC, DO, CH, the CH sound, Echdoche, or Echdoche. Echdoche, it's that CH, it's the strong CH sound, the chi sound. This is a really interesting word because you can see the EK or EC, this is the primary preposition that means specifically out or from. And then here's, this word should be really important to you because this is dechomai. And dochemai is the word that means to receive. Now, why is that an important word to you? Because almost all the times where we have a translation to receive, remember what word they use? Lambano. Everybody remember what lambano means? To take. Matter of fact, it means to take is a great word, but it really literally means to grasp strongly. And for some reason, our translators have translated lambano to be receive, which is completely opposite. It doesn't mean receive, it means to take. This is the word that means literally to receive. So, out receive, what does it mean? It means, this word means to accept from some source, to an expectation. However, in the King James, it is translated looking foreign. Now, I don't know how you get looking foreign from this word at all in the King James. The NIV does not translate it this way, but in any case, we've got it. Now, back to where we were. We are in a very, very complex section that continues to be complex and does not stop being complex. And why didn't it print my... supposed to print the other one. Anyway, and we were at a very, very complex set of words in 25. So the translation of this was, let us not give up meeting together as some are. This is 25:10. And I for some reason, my printer did not print the 105 page. So I don't know why I lost it. But anyway, here's the NIV. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. This was the literal. We already parsed this, so I'm going to give you the literal translation of this. Lest leaving behind in some place, in down leave, the complete collection over together lead of ourselves, which is, that's the epi synagogue word, just as down which how, a usage of some persons, others things call us near, and so vast as this more as much as we look at the day is made near, in the sense of near enough to throttle. This is that word epigerio, I think. So I said I'm going to give you, here's a translation of this. Lest leaving behind, and it's still kind of complicated, lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of yourselves, lest leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of yourselves, just as a usage of some persons, other things call us near, and so vast as the more, as much as we look at the day, comes near enough to do something about. Now I told you I wanted to parse this so we could understand what it means in the Greek, because this is a very, very complex set of words. It does not mean, I'll just be upfront, it does not mean let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. That is not even close to what the Greek says. So if we want to understand the Greek, the problem is to parse this to understand what it means. So again, you have to go back to where, what, and how. Why are these people here? What are they doing here? And what's going on? So number one, we established, and I think this is a correct establishment, that this book, the Logos to Telos of Hebrews, which is not to Hebrews at all, it is to, and I've been trying to prove this to you beyond a shadow of a doubt. I hope you're convinced. This is to the Romans, this is to Greeks, this is to Hebrews, and this is to the Egyptians as groups. And the point of the work is to prove a Logos to telos of why does this matter to me? What is the point? Why does this matter to me? Right now we have reached the point of the law as applicable to sacrifice. And the reason this is a huge deal for these people is because, remember, you have the Galil, you have Jerusalem, you have Alexandria, and you have Babylon. It's further over this way. Jerusalem, I have postulated to you, and I think most scholars will agree that Hebrews is not an early date document. When I say early date, we talk about before the temple. Now, a lot of I'm going to say fake theologians, okay? It's like fake news. There are fake theologians and fake people out there that try to put the New Testament documents into the 2nd century. If anyone says that, ask for their proof. Because I got great proof that the documents were written in the 1st century, and there are even fragments of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the 1st century. Matter of fact, I have a copy of John from 130 AD. It's the earliest copy extant of any complete gospel from 130 AD. I have fragments of Mark, and I have the Didache and other documents and fragments of those documents, especially from the Nag Hammadis, that I know that these documents were written well before that. So the earliest fragments or the earliest full pieces we have are from the 2nd century. But that doesn't, as I've proven to you over and over again, that's not, we know that they came from earlier. So if we know or state that Hebrews, and I think this is very accurate, is a post-destruction of the temple document. We're saying around, let's say, 70 AD. The reason for that document is very obvious. Why would I write a document, especially to Alexandria and all the groups in Alexandria? Because they're having problems. And the reason they're having problems is 70 AD was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. There's also another temple the Essenes built. The Essenes temple is an illegal temple, but they were sacrificing according to the documents we have about the Essenes. The Dead Sea Scrolls tell us this. So we know they were illegally. The Essenes have their own thing, and you can, Essenes and the Galilean school, these also happen to be the 4 schools of Pharisaic rabbinic thought. So you have the Jerusalem school, the school of the Galil, the Babylonian school, and the Alexandrian school. By the way, the Jerusalem Talmud was written in Jerusalem, and the Babylonian Talmud was written in Babylon. So there are 2 different versions of the Talmud, which were reconciled later. So we don't know exactly what the huge differences were. There are also documents that were added into the Talmud from Alexandria, especially in this period. So we know that these people, there was a huge diaspora. There was another diaspora caused by the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which many people came here. And what is in Alexandria? A temple. There is a temple in Alexandria. It's also an illegal temple. But here's the question that they had. The huge question that, okay, you have the sects. You have Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. These guys have a problem. What's their problem? And
The temple in Jerusalem.
you have to go to the temple in Jerusalem to sacrifice, right? And I want you to be very clear about this. You know, they talk about worship, for example, right? Where do you worship God? What do you study about God?
In the synagogues.
Yeah, and guess what? You worship God in the synagogue. The purpose of going to the temple is to worship God, but you worship God in the temple through sacrifices. I think it's really interesting that, for example, you'll see in the verses about Anna, and we need to probably do that, Luke? But go through about Anna. It says that she spent all of her time in the temple, and you notice it says she was worshiping and fasting. Why would she be worshiping and fasting? If you live in the temple, what do you eat?
Meat.
Yeah, sometimes.
You eat meat. You only eat teruma. She obviously was wealthy, because what that meant if you lived in the temple is you would eat teruma. When could she not eat teruma? Now, you notice that she was 84, so she'd probably been eating teruma every day of her life, so she wasn't fasting as much as she was. But a woman who's menstruating can't eat teruma. So they're very interesting. This stuff isn't coded. The person reading this in the first century, Luke, was written to the Jewish people, was written probably to a Jewish leader. So when he read that, it was obvious what they were saying. It was obvious what was going on. But to us'ns, we don't have a Jewish temple. You know, matter of fact, the Jewish temple's been gone for 2,000 years, right? So it's impossible for us to know what they did every day. You have to read Edersheim. Yes, sir.
Just a thought. Obviously, there's a difference to the Jews between a tabernacle and a temple. They couldn't revert back to a tabernacle system after the temple was destroyed or something like that. What was the big distinction there? I was just trying to think if they had a need, they could have built a temporary solution to it instead of what they did. So.
I don't necessarily disagree, but you know, the focus of their whole belief system at that time was kind of very interesting and allowed them to accommodate kind of what they did. So, for example, you know, you would have thought, and I'm going to put my foot in the theological pool. If you were God and you just suddenly wiped out a person's whole basis, foundation, corner, capstone, right? Capstone of their entire belief system, what do you think they would do?
They would be really confused. They would not know what to do.
Well, if I held out to them, see, the thing is that Teen Hodos held out to them the resolution of the problem.
Right.
In the Messianic era, all I need is the Thanksgiving sacrifice, right? I don't require the other sacrifices. You still have a problem because you don't have a temple, but your resolution of the problem is what Hebrews is about, right? Hebrews is resolving this problem for them. And that's what the question is here. Okay. So let's look at this in the context. Lest leaving behind in some place the epi-synagogue of ourselves. Lest leaving behind in some place the epi-synagogue of ourselves. So I told you, when all these people, when all the Jews and others, Teen Hodos, remember Teen Hodos was starting to pick up what? Greeks and Romans. Remember? The centurion, right? The centurion, the Romans. Guess what there's lots of in Alexandria? There's a couple of legions in Alexandria. Because Alexandria is one of those kind of problem areas, right? So they got problems there, they got problems there. They had 2 legions there we know of. We believe they had 2 legions in this area. There are lots of legionnaires and legions. And legionnaires and legions worshipped, you know, Mithras. They're huge Mithras believers. But I'm getting all kinds of Romans. Mithras is a mysterion. It's a mysterion religion. So you can still believe in the gods and goddesses and have Mithras as your main man. And so what's happening is Remember I told you Christianity looks like, or Teen Hodos looks like a mysterion. That's why they called it, that's why the Greeks call it Christian. They named it after the god, the lead head of the mysterion, which is Christ. The Christians didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Teen Hodos. They were a sect of Judaism. But the Judaistic sect said, do you have to be circumcised? No, you gotta be circumcised. Do you have to go through the mikvah? Oh yeah, you do. Every time? No, just once. So it had become a very popular thing because it fit within the mysterion, and it answered their questions. It answered their questions. What do you think all these people getting this letter from the Hebrews wanted the answer to be? Yeah, it matters to me. Because if it matters to you, then what can you get? You know all those promises? You know the promises? Look, the promises that Jesus guys said to the Jewish people and to the people, that could be yours, right? And what did he promise? Salvation. To make sarx, psuke, and pneuma. The Greeks knew you had sarx, psuke, and pneuma. The problem they had is they believed they were fated. Jesus Christ promised what? You're not fated. The gods aren't fated. God is not fated. God chooses, you can choose. So this is a huge thing for them. Because if you're not fated, what does that mean?
You have a choice.
You can grow up to be, you don't have to be grow up to be, okay, if you're the son of a fisherman, you don't have to grow up to be a fisherman. If you're the son of a farmer, you don't have to be a farmer. You know, if you're the son of this or the son of that, you don't have to grow up to that, right? And what do we call it? We call it the American dream, right? In America, nobody grows up thinking, well, I was a garbage man's son, I'm going to be a son of a garbage man. Or a lot of people who think they're going to end up being a wealthy person, you know, waste their wealth like the rich young ruler and end up, you know, feeding the pigs. So I'm just saying that, you know, in a world where you're not fated, suddenly there's hope for everything. And so these people all want that to be true. So when they all came down there, guess what it says? Leaving behind in some place the episynagogue. Least leaving behind in some place the episynagogue. I told you, remember, we said where the Jews go every Sabbath, they're supposed to go to the synagogue to pray and study about God. Guess what they did to Teen Hodos? They booted them out of synagogues. They booted well, a lot of the people that were in Teen Hodos were Gentiles. And so they couldn't go to the temple. And guess who they didn't let in the synagogues? If you're a Gentile, you think you're going? Maybe, maybe not, right? It depends on what they're thinking. But guess what they were doing? Least you're contaminated with that Teen Hodos view, right? Because if you have a Teen Hodos view, what might you do? Proselytize people, right? Tell them about Jesus. If you're telling, okay, think about this. Think about this. All these Jews are coming from the diaspora. The temple's destroyed. They have no hope because the temple's destroyed. There is a temple in Alexandria. What do I hold out to them? Hope. Elpis. Teen Hodos has the answer. Guess what? Do you need a sacrifice for sin? No. Do you need an ascension sacrifice? No. Do you need a priest sacrifice? No. You only need one sacrifice, the Thanksgiving sacrifice. And by the way, if you go look back in the Old Testament to do the Thanksgiving sacrifice, it's really interesting. Do you need a temple? Do you remember? Okay, let's go way back. Remember Exodus? We'll talk about Exodus in a thing. When they did the Exodus and the Passover, did they need a temple?
No.
No. Because every person raised their own lamb and sacrificed. Now, it was in the second temple period, actually the third temple period, but they call it the second temple period, okay? In the second temple period, what were they in the habit of doing? If you read Centurion, it's all in there, but it's historical. It's right out of Edersheim and right out of the Josephus. They began sacrificing the Passover lamb at the temple. As a matter of fact, they had a gig going, and this answers the question why they didn't do tabernacles, because there's a great gig going. The gig was, we, the Levites, bring all these lambs into Bethlehem in Judea in the spring for the Passover. And when you come and you're bringing your little lamb to sacrifice in the temple, and we go, there's a bit of dust on that little lamb. You can't sacrifice that lamb. We won't do it. But guess what? We'll trade your lamb for this other lamb. It only costs you another couple of denarii, and we don't make any profit on it. But you do have to transfer your money over here in the temple funds, because we don't accept denarii, even though that's the currency of the world. We won't accept it because the denarius has what on it? It has images. In fact, it usually had Athena on it. Athena on the front, and it would have a thing on the back. So that was a goddess. But you have to take your denarii and you go you translate over here into temple money. And then the temple money is worth less, so it'll take you, instead of 2 denarii, it's going to cost you about 1 RA. Oh my goodness. But we'll give you a trade-in and we'll give you a guarantee and you'll get a free license. So here's your lamb. And they did that. That was their gig. See? So they had racked up the sacrificial system. As a matter of fact, when Christ was crucified, we know that they did the Pharisees, or they did the Sadducees, priest families first, and the second go they did the Pharisees, and the third go they did the people. So they did it late because the water clock in the temple, remember, it was dark, and they weren't supposed to sacrifice at dark during Christ. So when they sacrificed, they started the sacrifices late and didn't get them completed. So the common people didn't get their Seder Passover lamb when Christ was crucified. That's also, we got, anyway. There's really deep stuff about this, but the thing is that in the Passover, the original Passover did not require a temple. So therefore, you could do the Seder or Passover lamb on your own. You just had to have a mechanism to legally sacrifice or kill, slaughter the lamb. And I told you, the Jews had already figured that out. They had kosher butchers. So guess what Teen Hodos could offer? And this is what Hebrews is about. They could offer the Thanksgiving sacrifice. What do you think the Jews, all these diaspora Jews, would think about that? And all the Teen Hodos members would think about that? Freedom. Yeah. Now, the problem, though, is when they came down especially, and all this group, remember I told you, they kicked them out of the synagogues. You think they let them in the temple? Nope, they wouldn't let them in the temple either. A lot of Gentiles with them. Teen Hodos was growing. Teen Hodos was huge by this time. We believe that a huge proportion of the city of Jerusalem probably was Teen Hodos, and a lot of the priests were Teen Hodos. It tells us that in Acts. If you figure that 1/3 of the whole, remember, 1/3 said, I believe, I'm convinced. 1/3 said, I'm convinced. 1/3 said, I want to hear some more. And 1/3 said, go away, right? If 2/3 of the people in Jerusalem of the Jews were convinced, along with all these Gentiles, Romans, and Egyptians, you got a huge amount of people that are Teen Hodos. The problem, though, is they are not allowed. Like I said, a lot of them were being kicked out of synagogues. We saw it in Corinthians and Ephesians. So where did they go? You notice we have a new word, epi-synagogue. I told you that last time. Epi-synagogue means over synagogue. It is a word meaning a grouping or a complete synagogue. So instead of going to the synagogue, Hebrews is telling us they were going to the epi-synagogue. And, okay, just the name of their church. It's like, okay, so here's a Catholic church over here, and here's the, the temple over here, right? Or here's the Lutheran church over here. I'm going to the epi-synagogue. That's where Teen Hodos is. He says, least leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of ourselves. So the episynagogue of ourselves is that place that they got together. Just as a usage of some persons. In other words, some of them are not leaving behind. Some of them, what are they doing? They're like Anna, right? Anna was in the temple every day. Now that's great if you're a prophetess and you're wealthy and you have enough money to buy all this stuff, but how's that going to work out for the average person? I mean, if you can handle it, that's cool. But what has Hebrews been telling us from the very beginning? What do the writers want you to do? When you get a letter from them, Hebrews, and you don't understand a point in the letter, they want you to do what? Take it to your neighbor. Even if your neighbor's not a Teen Hodos member. The whole point in the book in Hebrews is, if you don't understand a point, don't ask, okay, so you got the wise guy, right? Don't ask the wise guy. Don't ask the guy who's teaching a Sunday school class necessarily. Take the letter to the person who really understands Greek next door. And what happens then? Yeah, they'll ask. They'll say, wait, what does this say? You know, in helping you understand the document or understand the points. And of course, they don't have a letter in their hand. They can't do that. I mean, letters are worth, you know, a 40-acre farm. But the point is, people have really good memories. So if you have a point of question, then you go take that point of question outside of the episynagogue, right? The episynagogue, what are they supposed to be done? They're convinced, right? They're already convinced. If you're convinced, do you need any more help? No. That's the point of Christianity. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. I'm convinced. I don't need any more arguments. The logos to telos is, what do you do about these other little issues? There are other challenging issues. But he says, least leaving behind in some place the episynagogue of ourselves, just as a usage of some persons. So some people are not leaving the episynagogue. Some people are, it's like, okay, there are some churches, and I hope our church never gets this way, where if you're not there every day, if you're not there like every Wednesday, and you're not there every, you know, whatever, they're chalking it up and saying, hey, why weren't you there? Of course, you know, if we don't chalk up on our Sundays, then our elders will come bother us, right? That's probably a good thing. See if you're still alive and breathing. But the big deal is, you know, at a lot of places, you know, if you're not in attendance, they're taking you off, right? And saying, well, why aren't you there? Why don't you have your family here, right? This guy's, the writers of Hebrews is saying, hey, this gospel thing isn't for hoarding, isn't for keeping on your own. Some of these people are not going out of the episynagogue. They're going there all the time. They're being there all the time. Other things call us near. Other things call us near. What other things would call you near? Your work, your neighbor, the temple, right? Or the Thanksgiving sacrifice type thing. Maybe they're doing it at episynagogue. Maybe they're doing it as groups. We don't know. We're not clear about this in this period of time. But the point is that this is almost saying the opposite of what it appears to say in the Greek. Is saying opposite. And the last says, and so vast is this more as much. And so vast as this more as much, as we look at the day comes near enough to do something about. Okay, what is the day that comes near enough to do something about? You know, we say the end times, right? I don't think they're looking at the end times as much as they're looking at just their lives, right? In other words, okay, I'm going to try and put this in a cogent way. If I'm let's say I'm a Roman official, because we know there are Roman officials that were Teen Hodos members. And the Roman official, he goes to work. You think he talks about Teen Hodos at work? Nah. That's a good way to get like relieved of your job. Okay, if you're a Roman and you're starting to talk about proselytizing, because by the way, proselytizing is illegal under the Roman Empire. So you're not talking about it at work. Now, I come home and I take my family and we go to the episynagogue. And if I'm always going to the episynagogue, well, what about the gospel? I can't invite people from my work. If I'm not talking to my neighbors and I'm not interacting in the community, what's going on? Right? So, I'll reread this in NIV. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. I go for the day approaching part, but I think the day approaching they're talking about isn't necessarily the end times. It could be. The point they're talking about is what day is approaching. Well, the day of judgment, yeah, okay, the day of a person's death, the day of whatever. If you have the hope, right, of this gospel, and the hope of the gospel is not getting out, like, okay, in Jerusalem was a static kind of thing, right? Well, that's not the right way of saying it. Before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, okay, the people that were teen hodos were trying to go to synagogues and were probably kicked out, right? But there was huge stuff going on, right? They would go to the temple.
It said that in Acts that they were daily sacrificing in the temple.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the Gentiles, right? And the Gentiles could not participate in Teruma. There's a lot in depth in here, because remember, the Apostolic Council said, do not eat meat sacrificed to idols. It didn't say you couldn't eat meat that was sacrificed at the temple. They're not supposed to be eating teruma. The Gentiles aren't, right? But what do you think is happening? They're getting meat sacrificed in the temple, and they're able to eat it outside of the temple grounds. Remember the Passover? We don't know the full implications of how their system worked for sacrifice. We do know how the system worked for the Greek sacrifice. The Greek sacrificial system provided all the meat for people to eat. That's why the temples were next to the marketplace. You see what I'm saying? So when you went from here, there was interaction, and a lot of people were coming to know. A lot of people in different groups were coming to know Teen Hodos's gospel message. But when they went to Alexandria, even though the people were dispersed, right, the groups were dispersed, apparently, according to Hebrews, they were being gathered into episynagogue. They were, in other words, they were keeping to themselves. If you look back at the beginning of Hebrews, there's that message about keeping to yourself, etc., etc. They're trying to get the people to interact. So let's go a little bit further. Let's go to 26 and see how that fits, because I think you'll be astounded. Yeah, I got more. Okay, pass my notes. Translational notes. 26. It sounds like it made a transition. 26, it says, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left. Now you remember, this 26 goes back to the theme or the ideas that we've been talking about very strongly prior to 25. But 25 looks totally different, right? 25 says, and here's the translation, let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. But then 26 says, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we've received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left. That appears to be completely a non-logical transition, doesn't it? So let's see how this fits. Let's see what it actually says. In 26, 4, gar, assigning a reason, gar means a logical, we're making a logical argument. Assigning a reason, the if is added, we is hemon, that's of us. Hamentero, missed the mark, willfully, voluntarily, amid, meta, that is added. We is added, but it's implied. We have is added, implied. Lambano. We have lambano. We have taken, to take. The is there. Knowledge is epigenosis, recognition. Upon to know. Of is added. The is ho. Aletheia. Aletheia, not false. There is added, remaineth. Apoliapo, to leave behind. No more is oikite, no longer. Thusa, peri is through hamantia. So here's a literal translation. Assigning a reason of us miss the mark. Voluntarily amid, we have taken the recognition upon to know the not false. We leave behind, no longer sacrificed through a sin. No longer sacrificed through a sin. Here's a translation of this that fits the Greek. Assigning a reason if we miss the mark voluntarily amid our recognition of the truth, we leave behind the sacrifice because of a sin. So, assigning a reason if we miss the mark voluntarily amid our recognition of the truth, we leave behind the sacrifice because of a sin. This is a statement of irony. This is a statement of irony, but it fits in the previous context of 25. Because what it's saying is this. They have left behind a sacrifice for a sin. Therefore, they have no other option but to aim for the mark. Remember, we have the three problems of sin. We have cleanliness, we have the antinomia, and we have miss the mark, hamantia. So, Jesus Christ solved the problem of antinomia. Jesus Christ solved the problem of hamantia. Miss the mark. This problem of cleanliness is solved by baptism. In baptism, I'm convinced and therefore I'm baptized, right? And I have come into the episynagogue, into the group. The problem is that logically, and this is the point before, if you're convinced, if you are convinced and you are convinced that this is not a problem anymore, right? As a Hebrew, what do I have to do? As a Hebrew person, if I want to approach God, I'm trying to get the right color. That was working okay for a while. I have, number one, I have the ascension sacrifice. I have the sin. I have the guilt sacrifice. I have the priest sacrifice. And I have the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So to be a good Jewish person, right, I have to go to the temple and I have to do this, go through this to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Thanksgiving sacrifice is a tithe, by the way, just to be sure. The tithe, and there's some, other things that are required. They, in this period, had placed the Passover sacrifice as the Thanksgiving sacrifice. That's how they're getting this done. That's how it's happening. That's how it's working. So if I have given over, assigning a reason, if we miss the mark voluntarily, what's the only way to miss the mark voluntarily?
Not draw your bow, not aim.
Not aim. Not aim. Do you see how this fits back in the other thing? What is the point of hamantia? Okay, what's the mark? What is the obvious mark that all of these Teen Hodos members, as well as us as Teen Hodos members, what is the obvious mark?
Share the gospel.
To share the gospel. Exactly. We would say, and we would add to that, I don't disagree. Share the gospel is the most important thing, but we live the gospel, right? We live the gospel, and living the gospel, by the way, Angelia, right? The gospel is the message of the gods, and we are the messengers of the gods. Our purpose in life, look, if we're not here, can the gospel even get anywhere? I had someone mention to me the other day, said, well, God really doesn't need us. What? If you ain't living the gospel, guess what? There ain't nobody going to hear it. There ain't nobody going to live it. There's not going to be anybody doing it. You know, God needs us, and we are not only does God need us, He has made us what? We're like priests. We're like His sons and daughters, right? We are His children adopted through Christ. Do you think God would go through the whole adoption process? Do you go through the whole adoption process to have a kid, adopt a kid, and go, okay, go on. You know, I don't need you. No! The point of adopting children and adoption is so that that child can represent you. Right? We are God's representatives on earth. Astounding thing. That's what Hebrews is trying to tell you. That's what this whole point, that's why it fits in. You know, this point fits in. Because assigning a reason if we miss the mark voluntarily, we're not aiming at the mark. The point before is if you're sitting in the episynagogue and not talking to your neighbors, not going out, right? Not acting. I know this is their personal problem, but if you came from Jerusalem, you could be doing what in the episynagogue? Praying every day that God, are you coming? Are you coming? Are you coming? Right? And are you participating in anything that you're supposed to be doing? No. It's kind of like the frozen chosen. You hear about the frozen chosen, right? You come to church on Sundays and you're frozen chosen. You're in the same pew, the same place, probably the same facial expressions, right? Sing the hymns the same way all the time. The frozen chosen. Let's not be frozen chosen. The point of the gospel is, the mission field is out there, right? That's that little sign we have. So the argument they're making is it's not. What's that last? Here's a translation. If we deliberately keep on sinning after we receive the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left. That's not what it says. It says, assigning a reason, if we miss the mark voluntarily amid our recognition of the truth, we leave behind the sacrifice because of a sin. We leave behind the sacrifice. What sacrifice are you leaving behind? The sacrifice that Jesus Christ made that solves these problems for you. Right? If you're not doing, this is almost, and you can see why Martin Luther did not like Hebrews. Because Hebrews, a lot like James, tells us that if you're not living your faith, then you're not living the faith. You're not doing the gospel, you're not living your faith. That's what James says. The evidence of the gospel should be in your lives. And that's what the authors of Hebrews is telling us. So, although they are touching on very important aspects for the Jewish people, their basic answer is, get out of the synagogue and go tell people about Jesus. Go talk to them. They're not saying leave off the synagogue, but you see what they were probably doing? Right? You see what they're doing? They're going to the synagogue, the episynagogue, all the time. Every day. Probably. I'm trying to figure this out because that's the safe place for them. They're being persecuted, right? You remember the persecutions there were huge persecutions after the destruction of the temple. There are persecutions going on all over the Roman Empire because of not just, who are they persecuting right now? The Jews are getting really persecuted by the Romans because they had a rebellion in Jerusalem. And so the Jews are cracking down. But we know from Suetonius that they were also cracking down on Teen Hodos. Because Suetonius says that they were cracking down on the Mysterium of the Christus in Rome. This was just before Nero. So, okay, you know it. They don't have the telegraph, they don't have the teletype, and how long does it take to get a message someplace in the ancient world, right? So what happens in Rome takes 5 years to get out to the, well, maybe not quite that long, but it takes a while to get out to the boonies, which is the other end of the Mediterranean, right? So we are seeing reactions to that. Nero was dead, and he was still irritated about Jerusalem, even though he's dead. And that's one of the reasons they destroyed Jerusalem. It's because of Nero's, he was kind of upset. He also burned down Rome. But anyway, that's other issues. let's go to 26 and see how that fits. I do want to point out to you though, you notice that they used lambano means to take, and they turned it into a receive. And I think that is a foul, but that's all right. That happens, I guess. 27. But only a fearful expectation of judgment and a raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Here's what it says. But, that's but, ek doke, an expectation, literally a from receive, certain, tis, is some. It's not certain, it's some. Fearful, phoberos, frightful, looking is added, for is added, of is added, but implied, it's part of the verb. Judgment, Christ, a decision, and, kai, fiery, pure. Pure is fire from the gods. Indignation, zealous, heat, which is added. Shall is, it's not shall, it's to attend. To attend, devour, to eat. The hupen antios, covertly contrary to. So, here's what it says literally. But expectation from receive, but expectation, some frightful of a decision, and fire from the gods, heat, to attend to eat, the covertly contrary to. Here's what it says, here's a translation of that. But some expect frightful judgment and fire from the gods if they intend to eat the covertly contrary to. In other words, some secretly eat the sacrifice because of the expectation of punishment from the gods. Do you see how this fits? In other words, you have a large group of the going to the Epi synagogue. You have others in their group that are doing what? What are they doing? They're going to the temple to participate in the ascension, the guilt and sin sacrifice, the priestly sacrifice to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Why? What are they afraid of?
They're not convinced.
They're not fully convinced. The fully convinced know that what has been done.
Jesus took care of it.
Jesus took care of the problem. But there are those, and they're going covertly. Why? Because the Epi synagogue, those who came from the Epi synagogue and came from Jerusalem know you're not supposed to sacrifice outside of the temple, right? But we know that from Acts that the Teen Hodos was sacrificing every day in the temple. So now you go to Alexandria and it's illegal to sacrifice in the temple. So now you have groups of the Teen Hodos that are going to the temple covertly to sacrifice. This is a total, it's not a problem we have in this era, okay? Except for the fact, what's the problem we have in this era? I would say it's the opposite. People covertly doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and fearful of the fire of God, but they're doing it anyway. I mean, maybe that's a problem for all generations. It would be, I think, like for example, there are people that do things ritualistically, let's say, and they do it ritualistically because it's okay if you're not thinking about it, but if you really think that doing the ritualistic things will prevent some harm or suffering to you, right? We go to the Almighty God in prayer, and like for example, I use the Anglican prayer, morning prayer and evening prayer. I use their thing because it goes through a really cool stuff. The Psalms, goes through confession, it goes through, all the basic things that we do in our stuff. I do it because I feel that it's a very positive way to get myself in mind for prayer. But if I did that just as a ritualistic basis over and over and over again, instead of doing what I should be doing, right? Because what do you think a temple visit takes? You think that's quick? No.
Consumes most of your day, probably.
You're consuming a lot of your day probably to go to a temple thing to do stuff. And what the authors want the people to do is they don't want them to be clumped into Epi synagogue. They also don't want them sneaking away to the illegal temple but you do see their problem, right? If this is what you've been doing all your life, And this is what you've been doing in all your life in Tinhodos, right? And now you're in a totally different place. What are you going to do? It's as if there was one Lutheran church and you're supposed to go to one Lutheran church and you go to, you know, Athens or Alexandria and there's a false Lutheran church. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't fit as well, you know, as a good example. But I think you can see, right? These people have that problem. Yeah, Rick?
Well, you described a period of great transition here. I mean, the temple's destroyed. You know, the system that has existed for centuries is now turned upside down. You can certainly understand from their perspective that, hey, you know, what do? We're trying to do the right thing. We really don't know what the right thing is. We don't have a copy of Hebrews necessarily to tell us what to do, so we're trying to cover our bases. I mean,
Yep.
we're trying to be good, perhaps.
Yeah.
Or we're scared, and, hey, can I really trust this Teen Hodo stuff yet? Well, maybe I better cover my bets and go to the temple anyway. I mean, it's a tough period if you look at it from history.
It's a terribly tough period. And that's, if you can see that, you know, I would argue, and I've been arguing from the beginning, the reason Hebrews was written to these people is to try to solve this difficulty for them. And this is a worldwide difficulty. The thing is that, you know what happened to the rest of the world, right? Why don't they have this problem? Who proselytized them? All the way to Rome. Paul. Saul proselytized them. What did Paul say? It's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, right? He was in direct contradiction of the Apostolic Council. The Apostolic Council said, do not eat meat sacrificed to idols. Period. Dot. Paul said, it's okay as long as it doesn't cause your neighbor to have a problem, right? So all the Christians, all of Teen Hodos outside of Jerusalem and outside of this sphere had no problems. The big problem was when they went to Alexandria.
Was this like a big paradigm shift? Because I know Zeus, or they could sacrifice swine to Zeus. Does that mean that Teen Hodos could eat pork and Jews couldn't? Or was that still a big cultural taboo?
That is a great question, because remember when Cornelius and basically said, how did we solve the cleanliness issue? I'll throw this out and we can visit it next week. But the cleanliness issue was solved by baptism. If you're clean because of baptism, guess what you don't have to worry about? I can eat lobster. I can eat swine. I can do any of that because it's unclean, right? Once and for all. See?
It doesn't make you unclean.
It doesn't make you. And that goes back to Jesus saying, you know,
Yes.
what goes into a man doesn't make him unclean. It's what comes out of, right? And that was reinforced later. So all that stuff, Teruma stuff, hasn't gone away. It's just been superseded by baptism, which gets rid of all that. And I bet you didn't know that from, I'm glad it came up, because I bet you didn't know that from back. That's one of those basic Christian things, right? That we should have been taught. That why don't we do that? It's not just because Jesus said no, it's because that baptism solves it. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look at us this week. In your name we pray, amen.